Racist cops stop a black woman only to discover she's their new boss. It's a moment filled with tension, revealing the stark realities of prejudice and power and how quickly the tables can turn. Have you ever experienced something like this? Or seen someone treated unfairly just because of how they looked? This confrontation didn't just change the perspective of two officers. It set the stage for a powerful story of justice, reform, and standing up against bias. Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to share where you're watching from. Subscribe to our channel to ensure you don't miss more inspiring stories like this one. Chloe Carter gripped the steering wheel of her car, her knuckles pale against the leather. The morning sunlight filtered through the windshield, painting River Heights in a deceptively serene glow. It was her first day as police commissioner, a title she had fought tooth and nail to earn, yet the weight of the position pressed heavily on her shoulders. River Heights was no ordinary city. Beneath its surface lay decades of deeply rooted bias, systemic injustice, and a long history of police misconduct. The department she now led had become a symbol of mistrust, especially among marginalized communities. Change was necessary, but Chloe knew better than anyone that systemic reform didn't come without resistance. And resistance, she was certain, awaited her behind every corner. The road stretched ahead, winding like the challenges she anticipated. As Chloe approached the city center, her mind drifted to the past. A vivid memory surfaced, sharp as a knife. It was her first year as an officer, one of the few women of color in a precinct dominated by men who barely concealed their disdain. It was a departmental meeting, supposedly to address community concerns, but the atmosphere reeked of condescension. Chloe had dared to raise a point, suggesting reforms to bridge the growing divide between the police and the community. "What do you know about reform, Carter?" Sergeant Harris had sneered, leaning back in his chair with a smirk. "Maybe focus on proving you can keep up with the basics before tackling the big stuff." Laughter had echoed through the room, her colleagues exchanging knowing looks. Her face burned, but she didn't back down. "With all due respect, Sergeant," she'd said, her voice steady despite the humiliation, "if we don't change how we approach policing, the basics won't matter because we'll lose the public's trust entirely." Harris had waved her off, dismissing her like an errant child. That moment had stayed with her, not because of the embarrassment, but because it solidified her resolve. She'd made a silent promise to herself. One day she would be in a position to make the changes no one else dared to. Now, years later, she was. Chloe exhaled, pushing the memory aside as her car entered the city limits. The streets of River Heights were bustling, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the air, a palpable divide that felt like a fault line ready to fracture. As much as she wanted to be optimistic, she couldn't ignore the skepticism she had felt since her appointment was announced. Many within the department had made their displeasure known, subtly or otherwise. They didn't believe a black woman could or should lead them. The whispers, the veiled comments, the outright stares of contempt, they were all reminders of the uphill battle she faced. Lost in thought, Chloe almost didn't notice the flashing red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. She frowned, her pulse quickening. Was this a routine stop? For a moment she considered simply driving on, but protocol was ingrained in her. She signaled, pulled to the side, and turned off the ignition. The air outside her window seemed to thicken as two uniformed officers approached her car. Chloe lowered her window, her expression calm but guarded. The two officers approached with deliberate steps, their postures straight and authoritative. The older one, John Miller, had a face hardened by years of patrols and a demeanor that radiated skepticism. The younger officer, Lucas Hayes, walked with the kind of confidence that came from believing himself untouchable. "License and registration," Miller said flatly, his eyes scanning her car rather than meeting her gaze. Without a word, Chloe retrieved her documents and handed them over. Lucas leaned closer, peering through the window, his gaze lingering too long on her face. "What brings you to this part of town?" Lucas asked, his tone carrying a thinly veiled accusation. Chloe glanced at him briefly. "Driving to work," she replied evenly. Lucas smirked, exchanging a quick look with Miller. "Work? Around here?" His voice was laced with condescension. "This area isn't exactly welcoming. You sure you're in the right place?" "Nah." Her grip on the steering wheel tightened momentarily, but Chloe didn't let the irritation show. "I know exactly where I am," she said, her tone firm but controlled. Miller flipped through her registration, his lips pursed. "Not many people drive this model around here," he remarked, more to himself than anyone else. Lucas tilted his head, studying Chloe as though she were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. "You from around here?" "Nah, I'm where I need to be," she answered, meeting his gaze without blinking. Lucas stepped closer, resting a hand on the edge of her car window. "You've got an attitude," he remarked, his smirk returning. Makes me wonder what you're really doing here. This area's got its problems, you know. Crime, loitering. Officer, Chloe interrupted, her voice sharper now. Is there a specific reason for this stop? Or are you fishing for one? Miller cleared his throat, sensing the rising tension. Routine check, he said quickly, though his tone lacked conviction. Routine, Chloe repeated, her eyes narrowing slightly. I see. Lucas's smirk widened, and he leaned down slightly, his presence more invasive now. You seem awfully calm for someone being stopped by the police. Most people in your position would be a little more cooperative. Chloe's patience was wearing thin, but she remained composed. And what position would that be? She asked, her voice icy. Lucas opened his mouth to respond, but Miller cut him off. That's enough, he said, his tone a mixture of annoyance and warning. But Lucas wasn't done. Just saying, it's not every day we see someone like you in a car like this, around here. Chloe took a deep breath, her restraint hanging by a thread. Someone like me? She repeated, her words slow and deliberate. Lucas shrugged, feigning innocence. You know what I mean. Actually, I don't, she said, her gaze locking onto his. So why don't you clarify? The air between them grew thick with tension. Miller shifted uncomfortably, clearly trying to decide whether to intervene or let Lucas continue digging the hole deeper. Lucas leaned even closer, his hand still on her car. Look, lady, I'm just saying… Officer Hayes, Chloe interrupted, her voice sharp enough to slice through his words. She sat up straighter, her authority radiating despite her seated position. I suggest you step back from my vehicle. Lucas hesitated, his confidence faltering for the first time. What's your problem? He muttered, but he took a small step back. Chloe's eyes didn't leave his. My problem is that you seem to think this stop is about intimidation rather than procedure. Miller finally stepped in, clearing his throat loudly. Let's not complicate this, he said, attempting to regain control. Ma'am, if you just… No, Chloe cut him off, her tone unyielding. This is already complicated. Not because of me, but because of how you've both chosen to handle it. Lucas scoffed, but the confidence in his smirk was gone. Miller avoided her gaze, focusing instead on the registration in his hands. Chloe leaned slightly toward the window, her voice steady but cold. Officer Miller, Officer Hayes, let me save you both some time. My name is Chloe Carter, and as of today, I am your new police commissioner. The silence that followed was deafening. Miller froze, his jaw tightening as the realization hit him. Lucas blinked, his expression shifting from confusion to something resembling panic. Miller began, but his voice trailed off. Yes, Chloe said firmly, her eyes flicking between the two of them. And I'd like to know why I was stopped, questioned, and treated as though I didn't belong in this city. Lucas opened his mouth, but no words came out. Miller coughed, scrambling to recover. This was just a misunderstanding, he said weakly. No, Chloe replied, her voice cutting through his excuse. This was a demonstration of exactly why this department has a reputation problem, a demonstration of why I'm here. Miller stood stiffly, his discomfort evident. Lucas, meanwhile, was staring at her as though she might burst into flames at any moment. Chloe stepped out of her car, standing tall and imposing, despite her smaller stature compared to the two men. Here's what's going to happen, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Both of you will report directly to my office at the end of your shift. We'll have a detailed conversation about this stop and how it could have been handled differently. Miller nodded quickly, his face pale. Lucas muttered something under his breath, but one glare from Chloe silenced him. She turned back toward her car but paused before getting in. One more thing, she said, looking over her shoulder. The next time you stop someone, remember this moment, because I will. Without another word, she got into her car, started the engine, and drove off, leaving the two officers standing in stunned silence. I am Police Commissioner Chloe Carter, she declared, her tone firm and commanding. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. John Miller froze, his hand gripping the registration, his face blanching as understanding dawned. Lucas Hayes blinked rapidly, his bravado dissolving into a mix of shock and disbelief. Neither man spoke at first, the weight of her revelation sinking in. Commissioner, Miller stammered, finally breaking the silence. We didn't realize… That much is clear, Chloe interrupted, her voice cutting through his excuses like a blade. You didn't realize who I am, and you didn't care. That's the problem. Lucas found his voice, though it was shaky. We were just doing our job, he said defensively, though the words lacked their usual cockiness. Your job, Chloe repeated, her tone laced with incredulity. She stepped out of the car, moving deliberately. Standing before them, she folded her arms, her gaze sharp and unyielding. Explain to me, officers, what part of your job involves making assumptions about a driver based on where they are or how they look? Lucas hesitated, glancing at Miller as if for backup. Miller cleared his throat awkwardly. Ma'am, it was a misunderstanding, he said, his words fumbling. You thought what? Chloe snapped, her voice rising. That I didn't belong here? That I couldn't possibly be driving a car like this in this part of town without some ulterior motive? Or is it simply that you've done this so many times, you don't even question it anymore? Miller's mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. Lucas's expression hardened briefly, a flicker of defiance flashing in his eyes before fading under her unrelenting stare. Chloe took a step closer, her voice low but heavy with authority. Let me make this very clear. What you've shown me today isn't just poor judgment. It's systemic. It's exactly the kind of behavior that erodes public trust and makes people fear the police instead of respecting them. And if this is how you conduct yourselves regularly, then you're part of the problem I'm here to fix. Lucas, desperate to salvage his pride, blurted, We weren't trying to cause trouble, Commissioner. If we'd known that I'm your superior, Chloe interrupted sharply. So it's acceptable to harass someone as long as they aren't in a position of authority? Is that what you're saying? No, Lucas said quickly, shaking his head. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? Chloe shot back. Because from where I'm standing, it seems you were more interested in asserting dominance than upholding the law. Miller, realizing the futility of arguing, tried to steer the conversation. Ma'am, we'll ensure this doesn't happen again. You'll ensure it doesn't happen again, Chloe interrupted, her voice dripping with disdain. By reporting directly to me from now on. Every stop you make, every interaction you have, I will personally review it. Do I make myself clear? Yes, Commissioner, Miller said quickly, nodding. Lucas hesitated, his jaw tight. Finally, he muttered, Yes, ma'am. Chloe's eyes locked onto him, her gaze unwavering. You may not like the changes coming, Officer Hayes, but you'd better adapt, because if I hear about anything like this again, you won't just be reporting to me, you'll be explaining yourself in front of an internal review board. Understood? Yes, ma'am, Lucas said through gritted teeth. Chloe let the silence hang for a moment longer, ensuring her message had sunk in. Finally, she turned back to her car. Remember this, she said over her shoulder. This stop isn't just about me. It's about everyone who has been made to feel like they don't belong. That ends now. Without another word, she got into her car, started the engine, and drove away. As the officers watched her car disappear, Miller exhaled shakily. Well, he muttered, running a hand over his face, that's one hell of a way to start the day. Lucas didn't respond, his face a mixture of anger and humiliation. The conference room was packed, a sea of uniformed officers seated in stiff rows, their expressions ranging from guarded to openly defiant. Chloe Carter stood at the front, her posture tall, her presence commanding. The tension in the air was palpable as officers exchanged murmurs, their voices hushed but heavy with curiosity and skepticism. Chloe wasted no time. Good morning, she began, her voice cutting through the chatter. I've called this meeting to address an incident that took place earlier today, a routine traffic stop that was anything but routine. The murmurs stopped, replaced by a heavy silence. Chloe let the weight of her words linger, her gaze sweeping across the room. I won't name the officers involved, she continued, because this isn't about individuals. It's about the culture that allows incidents like this to happen. It's about how this department conducts itself and how that conduct erodes the trust of the people we are sworn to serve. Her words landed like a punch, drawing uneasy shifts in the audience. But not everyone was quiet. Commissioner, a voice interrupted, sharp and unyielding. Richard Grant, a seasoned captain with a grizzled face and a reputation for speaking his mind, stood up. His tone was firm, bordering on accusatory. With all due respect, this sounds like you're blaming the entire department for the actions of a few. Chloe turned to face him, her expression calm but firm. With all due respect, Captain Grant, I'm addressing a pattern. This morning's incident is not isolated. It's part of a broader issue, one that we must confront if we want to regain the public's trust. Grant crossed his arms, his brow furrowing. We're police officers, Commissioner, not politicians. Our job is to enforce the law, not worry about public relations. Chloe's eyes narrowed. And how do you enforce the law without the trust of the community? How do you expect cooperation from people who view us as antagonists instead of allies? The room was silent, the tension mounting. Grant didn't back down. You can't hold this entire department accountable for the mistakes of a few bad apples, he argued. Bad apples, Chloe repeated, her voice carrying a sharp edge. She stepped closer to the rows of officers, her gaze locking onto Grant's. I've heard that phrase too many times, and every time, It's used as an excuse to ignore the rot spreading through the system. This isn't about a few individuals. It's about the system that protects them, the silence that enables them, and the culture that tolerates them. A ripple of murmurs swept through the room again, some officers nodding in agreement, while others exchanged skeptical glances. Grant shook his head, his frustration evident. "Commissioner, we're out there risking our lives every day. We make split-second decisions in dangerous situations. And now we're being told to tiptoe around, afraid of being accused of bias every time we do our jobs?" Chloe's tone turned cold. "What you call tiptoeing, I call accountability. And if accountability makes you uncomfortable, Captain, then perhaps you should question why that is." The room erupted into hushed whispers, the officers visibly divided. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding Chloe's gaze. Others nodded in quiet agreement, their faces resolute. An officer from the back raised his hand, his voice hesitant but firm when Chloe acknowledged him. "Commissioner, I think what you're saying makes sense, but changing how we operate, it's going to take time. A lot of us are set in our ways. How do you plan to make this work without alienating the entire force?" Chloe's tone softened slightly, though her resolve remained unshaken. "I know this won't be easy. Change never is, but it's necessary. We can't keep doing things the way we always have and expect different results. I'm not here to tear this department down. I'm here to rebuild it, to make it stronger, more effective, and more respected." She turned her attention back to the room at large. "But let me be clear. No one in this department is above the law. Not you, not me, not anyone. If we want the public to respect us, we must first respect them. That means holding ourselves to the highest standard of conduct. Anything less is unacceptable." Grant opened his mouth to respond, but Chloe held up a hand, cutting him off. "This isn't a debate," she said firmly. "This is a directive. Every officer in this room will be held accountable for their actions. There will be training sessions to address bias and proper conduct. There will be oversight on all stops, arrests, and interactions with the public. And there will be consequences for those who fail to meet these standards." The room was silent again, the weight of her words settling over the officers. "Some of you might not like this," Chloe continued, her gaze sweeping across the room. "Some of you might think I'm being too strict or unfair. That's fine. You don't have to like me, but you will follow my orders, because if you can't, you don't belong here." Grant's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Other officers shifted in their seats, some looking down, others staring straight ahead, with a mixture of defiance and contemplation. Chloe stepped back, letting the silence linger before delivering her final words. "This department has a choice: evolve or collapse under the weight of its own failures. I suggest you choose wisely." Without waiting for a response, she turned and left the room, her footsteps echoing against the tiled floor. As she walked out, Chloe knew the room was divided. Winning over the entire department wouldn't happen overnight, but she was prepared to fight for every inch of progress. Her battle wasn't just with the system, it was with the people who upheld it, inside and out. The tension within the department simmered, unspoken but ever-present. Chloe Carter's reforms had stirred discomfort among the ranks, particularly within a faction of officers who resisted change. At the center of this silent rebellion was Captain Richard Grant. He didn't voice open defiance during meetings, but his influence was undeniable. Conversations among officers turned critical in his presence, a chorus of doubt and resentment echoing in hushed tones. One morning, Chloe's office door swung open. Her deputy, Angela Reyes, entered, her expression tense as she held out a tablet. "You need to see this," Angela said, her voice clipped. Chloe took the device, her brows furrowing as she pressed play on the video. The footage was shaky, likely recorded from a smartphone, but the scene was unmistakable. Officer Lucas Hayes stood beside a patrol car, interrogating a black man who appeared calm but increasingly frustrated. "What are you doing here?" Lucas's voice was audible, the same tone Chloe had heard during her own traffic stop. The man's response, polite but firm, was met with further questioning, Lucas's demeanor growing more aggressive. The video ended abruptly, but the damage was already done. Chloe set the tablet down, her jaw tight. "Where is he?" "On duty," Angela replied. "The video's gone viral. The community's furious." Chloe didn't hesitate. "Bring him in, now." Within an hour, Lucas Hayes was standing before Chloe in her office. He shifted uncomfortably, his usual arrogance replaced by a nervous energy. Chloe didn't offer him a seat. "Explain yourself," she demanded, her voice cold and clipped. Lucas hesitated, his gaze darting around the room. "Commissioner, that video doesn't show the whole story. The guy was acting suspicious." Chloe slammed a folder onto her desk, cutting him off. "Suspicious? Is that your justification for profiling him? Because that's exactly what it looks like to everyone watching that video. Lucas bristled, his pride flaring. With respect, Commissioner, I was following procedure. Procedure? Chloe's tone was scathing. Explain to me what part of our procedure involves escalating a simple interaction into a public spectacle. And let me remind you, this isn't the first time your actions have been called into question. Lucas opened his mouth to respond, but Chloe held up a hand. Save it. You'll explain yourself to the entire department. Later that day, the entire force gathered in the conference room, the tension thicker than before. Officers whispered to one another, their eyes flicking between Chloe, standing at the front, and Lucas, seated near the center. Chloe didn't waste time. Earlier today, I reviewed a video that has put this department under public scrutiny yet again. She began, her voice steady but sharp. Officer Hayes, step forward. Lucas rose reluctantly, his expression a mixture of defiance and discomfort. Chloe gestured toward him. Explain to your colleagues why your actions in that video were acceptable. Lucas cleared his throat, avoiding the stares of his peers. The man in the video was loitering. I stopped to ask him some questions and he got defensive. The video doesn't show how he was behaving before the recording started. Chloe let the room absorb his words before responding. And yet, everything that was recorded shows you escalating a situation unnecessarily. Was he committing a crime? Lucas hesitated. No, but... Then why did you treat him like a suspect? Chloe's question hung in the air, unanswered. That was when Richard Grant stood, his voice cutting through the silence. Commissioner, this is getting out of hand. Hayes was doing his job. The guy in the video could have been casing the area. It's easy to criticize when you're watching from behind a desk. Chloe turned to face him, her expression ice cold. And it's easy to make excuses when you're not the one being targeted. Captain Grant, are you suggesting we allow our officers to stop and interrogate citizens without probable cause simply because they could be up to no good? Grant crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. I'm saying we need to trust our officers' instincts. They're out there on the streets, dealing with real threats. Second-guessing them only ties their hands. Chloe stepped closer, her voice steady but rising in intensity. And what happens when those instincts are based on bias? What happens when we allow personal prejudice to dictate who gets stopped and questioned? Let me tell you what happens. We lose the trust of the community. We undermine the very principles we're supposed to uphold. Grant didn't back down. Not every decision can be perfect in the heat of the moment. Policing isn't black and white. Chloe's gaze hardened. But accountability is. If we can't hold ourselves to the highest standard, how can we expect the public to respect us? How can we expect them to feel safe? The room was silent, the officers caught between the two towering figures. Chloe turned back to Lucas. Officer Hayes, your actions have consequences. Effective immediately, you're suspended pending an internal review. And let me be clear, this department will not tolerate profiling, harassment, or any behavior that undermines our mission. Lucas's face flushed with anger, but he didn't argue. He nodded stiffly, his hands clenched at his sides. Chloe shifted her attention to the room at large. To everyone here, this is a turning point. You can either rise to the challenge of reform or remain stuck in a system that fails the people it serves. The choice is yours. But know this, change is not optional. Grant sat back down, his face a mask of barely concealed frustration. The officers were silent, their expressions ranging from support to resistance. As the meeting adjourned, Chloe watched the officers file out, their murmurs a mixture of outrage and grudging respect. She knew she had made enemies today, but she also knew she had allies. Chloe returned to her office, her resolve unshaken. If this was the resistance she faced on the surface, she could only imagine the battles waiting beneath. It was time to take even stronger measures. Chloe Carter's decision to overhaul the department came swiftly and decisively. The first step was clear: transparency. She issued a directive requiring detailed documentation of every traffic stop, arrest, and community interaction. Reports were to include reasons for engagement, outcomes, and any use of force. These would be reviewed weekly by Chloe's office. No exceptions. At the morning briefing, Chloe stood before the assembled officers. This isn't negotiable, she said firmly. From today forward, every action you take in the field will be accounted for. I want data. I want facts. If there's nothing to hide, this shouldn't be an issue. A murmur rippled through the room, the tone unmistakably resistant. A senior officer, Lieutenant Daniels, raised his hand. Commissioner, with respect, this feels like micromanagement. We've been doing this job for years. Now you're telling us you don't trust us to do it right. Chloe met his gaze unflinchingly. I'm not here to micromanage, Lieutenant. I'm here to ensure accountability. This isn't about trust. It's about standards. If you've been doing your job properly, then these changes shouldn't affect you at all. Daniels opened his mouth to reply, but thought better of it. Chloe moved on, her tone unwavering. This isn't a punishment. It's a correction. And corrections are necessary when the system is broken. The next phase of reform was a department-wide training program. Chloe brought in experts on de-escalation tactics, implicit bias, and community engagement. Attendance was mandatory, and Chloe made it clear that participation would be closely monitored. The first session was met with predictable resistance. A group of seasoned officers lingered at the back of the training room, their arms crossed and expressions skeptical. Captain Richard Grant was among them, his disapproval practically radiating. De-escalation, one officer muttered under his breath, loud enough for Chloe to hear. Next, they'll have us holding hands with suspects. Chloe turned sharply, addressing the room with an edge to her voice. Do you have something to add, Officer Turner? Turner straightened, surprised she'd singled him out. Just seems like a waste of time, Commissioner. We're not the problem. The criminals are. Chloe's response was immediate. And how we treat those criminals, or anyone we encounter, is what determines whether the public sees us as protectors or predators. You don't have to agree with this training, but you do have to complete it, because change isn't optional. Grant stepped forward then, his tone calculated. Commissioner, some of us feel that these sessions are undermining the experience and instincts we've developed over decades. Policing isn't something you can teach in a classroom. Maybe not, Chloe replied evenly, but respect, accountability, and professionalism are. If anyone here thinks they're above learning, they're welcome to turn in their badge. Otherwise, take a seat. The room went silent. Slowly, even the most resistant officers sat down. Chloe knew she hadn't won them over. Not yet. But compliance was the first step. Not everyone resisted. A younger group of officers, many of whom had been inspired by Chloe's leadership, began embracing the reforms. Officer Megan Ellis, a recent recruit, approached Chloe after one of the training sessions. Commissioner, Megan said, her voice hesitant but sincere, I just wanted to say, this is making a difference. I didn't realize how much bias could affect the way we do our jobs. It's eye-opening. Chloe offered a small smile. That's the goal, Officer Ellis. Keep pushing yourself. The more we learn, the better we serve. Conversations like these were rare but encouraging. Chloe knew that the younger generation of officers could be the key to lasting change. Meanwhile, outside the department, the community was taking notice. A group of activists organized a peaceful demonstration in front of the precinct, holding signs that read, Accountability Now, and Support Commissioner Carter. Chloe watched the demonstration from her office window, a mix of gratitude and determination stirring within her. The public's support strengthened her resolve, but it also increased the pressure on the department. The officers who resisted reform now had to contend with the growing demand for change, not just from their boss, but from the people they served. During a press conference later that day, Chloe addressed the gathering crowd and media. This department exists to serve and protect the people of River Heights, she said. Reform is not an attack on our officers. It's a commitment to better policing. To those who support this mission, I thank you. And to those who oppose it, I invite you to join us in building something better. The applause was deafening, but Chloe didn't let herself get carried away. The real work was still happening behind closed doors, where resistance remained strong. Despite small victories, Chloe could feel the fractures deepening within the department. Officers like Megan Ellis were embracing change, while others, led by Richard Grant, dug in their heels. Chloe knew she couldn't force everyone to agree with her vision, but she could demand compliance. One evening, as Chloe reviewed the week's reports, Angela Reyes entered her office looking concerned. We've got a problem, Angela said. Grant's group is rallying behind him. They're not outright defying orders, but they're stalling, dragging their feet on reforms. It's creating friction. Chloe leaned back in her chair, her expression hardening. Then it's time to make it clear that resistance has consequences. Chloe Carter's office door slammed shut behind her. Angela Reyes stood nearby, her face a mixture of frustration and disbelief as she handed over a file. "You're not going to like this," Angela said bluntly. Chloe opened the folder and scanned the contents. Her stomach churned. It was a detailed report exposing Lieutenant Daniels, one of her supposed allies, actively undermining the department's reforms. He'd been feeding misinformation to the resistance within the force, encouraging delays in implementing Chloe's policies, and privately discrediting her leadership among the rank and file. "I trusted him," Chloe said, her voice low but seething with anger. Angela nodded. "We all did. He played it well, saying the right things in meetings, offering public support while sabotaging you behind the scenes." Chloe closed the file, her decision already forming. "Bring him in," she ordered. Daniels arrived at Chloe's office, his demeanor confident, almost smug. He clearly had no idea his betrayal had been uncovered. "Commissioner," he said with a faint smile, taking a seat uninvited. "What can I do for you?" Chloe placed the folder on her desk and leaned forward, her eyes cold and piercing. "You can start by explaining this," she said, sliding the report toward him. Daniels glanced at it, his expression flickering for just a moment before he composed himself. "I don't know what this is," he said smoothly. "Don't insult me," Chloe snapped. "I have evidence, emails, recordings, testimony that prove you've been working against me. You've encouraged defiance, undermined reforms, and spread lies about my leadership. Do you deny it?" Daniels hesitated, then leaned back in his chair. "I've been around long enough to know when a ship is sinking," he said, his tone calculated. "Your reforms are alienating the force, Commissioner. They don't trust you, and neither do I." Chloe's jaw tightened, but her voice remained steady. "This isn't about trust. This is about you betraying your oath and this department. Effective immediately, you're suspended without pay, pending termination." Daniel's face darkened. "You can't do this," he said, his voice rising. "You think firing me will fix your problems? You're making enemies faster than you can count." Chloe stood, her tone unwavering. "The difference between you and me, Daniels, is that I'm not afraid of enemies. Pack your things. You're done here." Daniels stormed out of her office, slamming the door behind him. Chloe exhaled slowly, steeling herself. The backlash from this decision would be severe, but she couldn't allow disloyalty to fester. The fallout was swift. That evening, Chloe returned home to find an unmarked envelope waiting in her mailbox. Inside was a handwritten note. "Leave now before it's too late. We don't need your kind here." The words were crude, the message unmistakable. Chloe stared at the note, her expression unreadable. She had expected resistance, even hostility, but the personal nature of the threat made her skin crawl. Over the next week, more letters arrived, escalating in intensity. One warned of consequences if she didn't resign. Another included a veiled threat against her family. Angela noticed Chloe's growing unease. "You need protection," Angela insisted during a late-night meeting. "I'm not backing down," Chloe replied firmly. "I'm not asking you to," Angela said. "But if something happens to you, everything you've built goes with you. Let us assign security." Reluctantly, Chloe agreed. Plainclothes officers were stationed near her home, and her movements were closely monitored. Despite the added precautions, the threats only deepened her resolve. As the department's internal conflict played out, the community began rallying around Chloe. At a city council meeting, a middle-aged black woman named Marsha Walker stepped forward to speak. Her voice trembled, but her words carried the weight of grief and determination. "My son Jamal was killed by this department," she began, her voice cracking. "He was unarmed. He didn't get a chance to explain himself before they decided his life wasn't worth it." The room fell silent, the weight of her story pressing down on everyone present. Marsha continued, her eyes locking onto Chloe. "Commissioner Carter, I see what you're trying to do. And I want you to know you have my support. You have this community's support because we're tired of losing our children. We're tired of burying our brothers and sisters. Don't give up. We need you." Applause erupted as Marsha stepped down, tears streaming down her face. Chloe stood, addressing the room. "Thank you, Ms. Walker," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "Your loss is a reminder of why this fight matters. I won't give up, and I promise you, I'll keep fighting for justice, no matter the cost." While the community's support bolstered Chloe's resolve, it further alienated those within the department who resisted her. Richard Grant called an unofficial meeting of his allies, rallying them against what he referred to as Chloe's reckless crusade. "She's tearing this department apart," Grant said, his voice filled with venom. "She doesn't understand what it means to be one of us. She's making us look weak, and the public loves her for it." One officer hesitated, his voice uncertain. "What if she's right, though? What if these reforms actually work?" Grant's glare silenced him. "This isn't about reform. It's about control. If we let her win, this department will never be the same." The news hit like a bombshell. A fatal police-involved shooting in the heart of River Heights had left a young, unarmed black man dead. The victim, identified as 23-year-old Marcus Hall, was reportedly stopped for a broken taillight. What should have been a routine interaction escalated into tragedy when shots were fired. Chloe Carter sat in her office, the grim details of the incident laid out in front of her. The media had already seized the story, and protests were erupting across the city. Outside the precinct, crowds gathered with signs demanding justice. "We don't have time," Angela Reyes said urgently, standing across from Chloe's desk. "The community wants answers, and the department is already being blamed. You need to act now." Chloe nodded, her face set. "Call an emergency meeting. I want every senior officer in the conference room within the hour. And notify Internal Affairs. We're initiating an independent investigation immediately." The tension in the room was suffocating as Chloe addressed the gathered officers. "This department is at a crossroads," she began, her tone firm. "A young man is dead, and the public is demanding accountability. I've ordered an independent investigation into the incident. Internal Affairs will have full access to all body cam footage, officer statements, and evidence. Transparency is non-negotiable." Her words were met with murmurs of discontent. At the back of the room, Richard Grant stood abruptly, his face dark with anger. "Commissioner," he said loudly, "with respect, you're throwing your own officers under the bus. You weren't there. None of us were. We don't know what happened yet." Chloe turned to him, her gaze icy. "Exactly, Captain. We don't know what happened. And that's why this investigation is critical. The people of this city deserve the truth, and if there was misconduct, they deserve accountability." Grant's voice grew louder, his frustration boiling over. "Accountability, or are we just caving to public pressure? Those officers were doing their job, and now they're being vilified because the public wants a scapegoat." Chloe stepped closer to the rows of officers, her voice rising with conviction. "This isn't about scapegoats, and it's not about caving. It's about justice. It's about making sure this department operates with integrity. If you think I'm going to let another life be lost without a full investigation, you're mistaken." Grant crossed his arms, his expression defiant. "And what happens if the investigation clears the officers involved? Do you think the public will just accept that? If the investigation is thorough and unbiased, the truth will speak for itself," Chloe shot back. "But sweeping this under the rug, as has been done before, is not an option." The room fell silent, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone present. The independent investigation began immediately. Chloe worked late into the night, reviewing initial reports and ensuring every piece of evidence was handed over to Internal Affairs. Meanwhile, the city's unrest grew. Protesters marched through the streets, chanting Marcus Hall's name and calling for systemic change. In the precinct, the divide between officers deepened. Those who supported Chloe's reforms stood by her decision to investigate transparently, while others, led by Grant, saw her actions as a betrayal. Grant's defiance culminated in a heated confrontation in Chloe's office. He stormed in unannounced, slamming the door behind him. "This has gone too far, Commissioner," he said, his voice brimming with anger. "The morale of this department is in the gutter because of you. Good officers are being second-guessed, and now you're hanging them out to dry over one incident." Chloe didn't flinch. "One incident? A man is dead, Captain. That's not something we can ignore. Morale doesn't matter if we're not doing our jobs the right way." Grant's tone turned accusatory. "And what about the officers' lives, their careers? Did you even consider what this investigation will do to them? Or are they just collateral damage in your crusade for reform?" Chloe stood, her patience thinning. "Don't you dare frame this as me attacking my officers. I'm holding this department to the standard it should have been upholding all along. If anyone's career is at risk, it's because of their own actions, not mine." Grant's jaw tightened. You're alienating the very people you need to lead. And you're protecting a culture that destroys trust in this department, Chloe countered, her voice cold. If you can't see the difference, maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here. The room fell silent as the two leaders stared each other down, the tension electric. Finally, Grant shook his head and left without another word, slamming the door behind him. As the investigation progressed, Chloe made a public statement. Standing before a sea of reporters, she spoke directly to the people of River Heights. This department is committed to transparency and justice, she said. The death of Marcus Hall is a tragedy, and we owe it to him, his family, and this community to uncover the truth. No matter the outcome, this investigation will be thorough and impartial. My promise to you is that this department will not hide from accountability. Her words were met with cautious applause. Among the crowd was Marcia Walker, the woman who had previously spoken out in support of Chloe. After the press conference, she approached Chloe, her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, Marcia said quietly, for standing up when so many were. Chloe nodded, her resolve unwavering. This is just the beginning, Ms. Walker. We have a long way to go. The investigation into Marcus Hall's death concluded after weeks of intense scrutiny. The final report, compiled by Internal Affairs, landed on Chloe Carter's desk in the early hours of a gray morning. She read it carefully, analyzing every word, every finding. It was clear. While the shooting wasn't premeditated, it was the result of poor judgment and a failure to follow de-escalation protocols. The officer involved, though not malicious, had acted recklessly and would face disciplinary action. Later that day, Chloe stood at the podium during a press conference, flanked by community leaders and department representatives. Reporters filled the room, their pens poised and cameras rolling. The investigation has revealed that the officer involved failed to adhere to proper procedure, Chloe announced. As a result, disciplinary measures will be taken, and additional training will be mandated for all officers to prevent incidents like this in the future. She paused, her voice steady but firm. This tragedy is a reminder of the responsibility we carry as law enforcement officers. It's not enough to enforce the law. We must do so with integrity, professionalism, and respect for every individual we encounter. Marcus Hall's death was preventable, and we owe it to his memory to ensure such failures are not repeated. The room was silent for a moment before applause erupted. While some skepticism lingered, it was clear that Chloe's commitment to transparency had resonated with many. That evening, as the precinct quieted, Officer Megan Ellis approached Chloe in her office. Megan had been one of the younger recruits who had embraced Chloe's reforms from the beginning, but tonight her demeanor was unusually solemn. Commissioner, Megan began hesitantly, I just wanted to thank you. Chloe looked up from her desk, raising an eyebrow. For what? For helping me see the bigger picture, Megan said, her voice steady but emotional. When I first joined the force, I thought being a cop was just about catching bad guys. I didn't think about the people we serve, the lives we touch or harm through our actions. Your leadership has changed that for me. Chloe leaned back in her chair, her expression softening. What made you realize that? Megan hesitated, then continued. The training sessions you implemented, they opened my eyes. I didn't realize how much bias could affect my judgment until I saw it in myself. And honestly, when I saw how you handled the Marcus Hall case, it gave me hope that we can actually be better. Chloe nodded, her voice quiet but resolute. That's what this is all about, Meg. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with people like you, willing to look inward and do the hard work. Megan smiled faintly. I won't let you down, Commissioner. I know you won't, Chloe replied. In the days following the investigation's conclusion, Chloe noticed a shift in the community's attitude. Protests that had once been filled with anger and frustration now carried an undercurrent of hope. Citizens began attending precinct-hosted forums, engaging with officers in constructive dialogue. One evening during a community meeting, an elderly man stood to speak. For the first time in years, I feel like we're being heard, he said, his voice trembling with emotion. Commissioner Carter, you've shown us that accountability isn't just a word, it's action, and that means everything. The applause that followed was deafening. Chloe felt a flicker of pride but remained grounded. The work was far from finished. Within the department, small but meaningful changes began to take hold. Officers who had once resisted reform started to adapt, realizing that Chloe's methods weren't about punishing them, but about building a stronger, more respected force. Despite these successes, Chloe was acutely aware of the challenges that remained. Richard Grant and his allies continued to resist, though their influence was waning. Chloe knew that true reform would take years, not weeks, and that setbacks were inevitable. One morning, Angela Reyes walked into Chloe's office with a fresh stack of reports. "The community response has been overwhelmingly positive," Angela said, setting the papers down. "But Grant's group is still causing friction. They're not outright defying you, but they're dragging their feet." Chloe nodded, her expression unreadable. "I expected as much. Change doesn't come without resistance. But as long as we keep moving forward, we'll get there." Angela hesitated before adding, "For what it's worth, the officers who've embraced the changes, they're making a real difference out there. People are noticing." Chloe allowed herself a small smile. "That's what matters." Chloe Carter stood before a group of community leaders, police officers, and city officials in a packed auditorium. On the screen behind her was a presentation titled, "The Future of Policing in River Heights." This was the culmination of months of struggle, conflict, and progress. She had come to set the stage for the department's long-term transformation. "The events of recent months have shown us the cracks in our system," Chloe began, her voice steady. "But they've also given us an opportunity to rebuild, to create a department that truly serves its people. That's what this plan is about." The crowd listened intently as Chloe outlined her new initiative. The Community Partnership Program, CPP. Officers would be assigned to specific neighborhoods, not just to patrol, but to engage with residents, attend local events, and build relationships outside of crisis situations. Civilian Oversight Committee. A diverse group of civilians would be established to review complaints against officers, ensuring transparency and accountability. Reform-Oriented Training Academy. New recruits would undergo training that emphasized de-escalation, cultural competency, and community engagement as much as traditional policing tactics. Community Justice Forums. Quarterly town hall meetings where residents could voice concerns directly to police leadership and collaborate on solutions to local issues. Chloe concluded her presentation with a challenge. "These aren't just policies," she said. "They're commitments to the people of the city, to the officers who wear this badge, and to the future we're building together." The room erupted into applause, but Chloe knew the real test would be implementing these reforms on the ground. Back at the precinct, the reaction to Chloe's plan was mixed. Younger officers, like Megan Ellis, embraced the changes eagerly, seeing them as a chance to redefine what policing could be. The older, more traditional officers remained wary, but had begun to realize that Chloe wasn't backing down. One surprising development was the transformation of Lucas Hayes. The once brash, haughty officer had undergone a noticeable shift since his suspension and subsequent reinstatement. One afternoon, he approached Chloe in her office. "Commissioner," Lucas began, his tone uncharacteristically sincere, "I wanted to thank you for giving me a second chance." Chloe raised an eyebrow, curious. "What brought this on?" Lucas hesitated, then said, "The investigation, the suspension, it forced me to take a hard look at myself. I realized how much I'd let my own biases dictate how I approach this job. I'm not proud of it, but I want to do better." Chloe studied him for a moment before nodding. "Acknowledging the problem is the first step. What are you going to do about it?" "I've started volunteering at the community center," Lucas said. "Figured it was time I actually got to know the people I'm supposed to be protecting." A flicker of approval crossed Chloe's face. "Keep it up," she said. "Actions speak louder than words." Chloe's reforms began to take root, slowly but steadily. The Community Partnership Program launched in 3 pilot neighborhoods, where officers like Megan Ellis worked closely with residents. Reports of positive interactions and increased trust trickled in, reinforcing the importance of the initiative. At the same time, the Civilian Oversight Committee began reviewing cases, providing transparency that had long been missing. While some officers bristled at the idea of being scrutinized by civilians, others began to see the value in restoring public confidence. During one of the community justice forums, an older officer named Frank Rivera stood up to address the crowd. "I've been on this force for 25 years, he said, "and I'll be honest, I didn't think these reforms would work. But I was wrong. I've seen firsthand how these changes are making a difference. And I'm here to say, Commissioner Carter, you have my support. The room erupted in applause, and for the first time, Chloe saw cracks in the resistance within her department. Of course, not everyone was on board. Richard Grant and his allies continued to push back, albeit more subtly. They complied with the new policies but made no effort to embrace their Chloe kept a close eye on them, determined not to let their resistance undermine progress. One day during a staff meeting, Grant spoke up. Commissioner, with all due respect, some of these programs are stretching our resources thin. We're spending more time at community events than on actual policing. Chloe's response was immediate. Captain Grant, actual policing isn't just about arrests and citations. It's about preventing crime by building trust. If you think attending community events is a waste of time, then you don't understand the fundamentals of this job. Grant opened his mouth to argue, but Chloe cut him off. This department is changing, Captain. You can either be part of the solution or you can step aside. The choice is yours. The tension in the room was palpable, but Grant said nothing further. Despite the ongoing challenges, Chloe began to see the fruits of her labor. Crime rates in the pilot neighborhood started to decline as residents and officers worked together to address underlying issues. Complaints against the police dropped significantly, and public opinion shifted in favor of the department's new direction. During a late-night conversation with Angela Reyes, Chloe reflected on the progress. It's a start, she said, sipping her coffee, but we're nowhere near done. Angela nodded. The fact that we're even seeing change this early is a testament to your leadership. But you're right, this is just the foundation. The precinct was quiet, the hum of the city outside fading into the background as Chloe Carter sat alone in her office. The dim light of her desk lamp illuminated the stacks of reports and plans before her, but her mind was far from the present. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on the framed photograph of her academy graduation that hung on the wall. She was barely 23 in that picture, her uniform crisp, her smile bright but cautious. Back then, Chloe had been one of only a handful of black cadets in her class. She remembered the whispered comments, the sidelong glances from her peers who doubted her place among them. One particular memory surfaced, her first field training assignment. Her training officer, a grizzled veteran named Mark Clayton, had barely masked his disdain when he saw her assigned to his. "You sure you're cut out for this, Carter?" he had asked on her first day, his tone dripping with skepticism. "This job isn't about looking good in a uniform." Chloe had swallowed her pride, meeting his gaze with quiet determination. "I'm here to do the work, sir, same as you." But proving herself hadn't been easy. During one incident, she'd called for backup after diffusing a volatile domestic dispute. When her colleagues arrived, instead of assisting, they questioned her judgment for not making an immediate arrest. It wasn't until the man involved thanked her for resolving the situation without escalating it that Chloe felt vindicated. But only to herself. The department remained silent. As Chloe stared at the photograph, she couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed and how much hadn't. Every step of her journey had been marked by resistance, from the academy to her first precinct, and now as commissioner. She thought back to the meeting that had nearly broken her spirit. Early in her career, she had suggested implementing community outreach programs during a department-wide meeting. "That's not our job," a senior officer had scoffed, cutting her off. "We're not babysitters. Let the social workers handle that." Her suggestion had been dismissed outright, and she had left the meeting feeling humiliated. But instead of retreating, she had doubled down, volunteering to lead smaller initiatives within her precinct. Slowly but surely, her efforts began to gain traction, even if her name was rarely mentioned in success. Chloe's thoughts shifted to her mother, who had been her rock through it all. "You're going to face a lot of closed doors," her mother had told her when she was just starting out. "But you've got the strength to kick them open. Don't let anyone tell you what you can or can't do." Her mother's words had carried her through countless sleepless nights, moments of doubt, and crushing defeat. And now they echoed in her mind as she looked at the precinct she had fought to reform. Chloe's reflection was interrupted by a knock on the. Angela Reyes stepped inside, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. "Figured you could use this," Angela said, setting one on Chloe's desk. "Thanks," Chloe replied, her voice soft. Angela glanced at the photograph on the wall. You've come a long way, she said, gesturing toward it. How does it feel looking? Chloe took a sip of coffee before answering. It feels complicated, she admitted. Every step forward came with its own battles. Sometimes I wonder if the fight ever really ended. Angela nodded. But you've made it count. The changes you've implemented, people are noticing. Officers like Ellis are seeing the bigger picture because of you. The community is beginning to trust us again. That's not. Chloe smiled faintly. It's not nothing, but it's not enough. Angela leaned against the desk, her tone turning serious. It's more than anyone else has done, and it's because you refused to give up, even when everyone was against you. That's not just leadership. That's legacy. Chloe let Angela's words sink in, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. As the evening wore on, Chloe returned to the stack of documents on her desk. Each paper represented a piece of the puzzle she was trying to solve. Policies that needed revision, training programs to expand, partnerships to forge with the community. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. It was a message from Megan Ellis. Thanks for believing in us, Commissioner. You're changing more than just the department. You're changing lives. Chloe set the phone down, her chest tightening with a mixture of pride and determination. This wasn't just about her. It was about the next generation of officers, the community she served, and the countless lives affected by the decisions made in her precinct. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, another young woman was dreaming of wearing a badge, of making a difference in a world that might doubt her ability. Chloe promised herself she would make sure that woman's path was a little easier than her own. Months had passed since Chloe Carter first stepped into her role as Commissioner of River Heights, and the changes she had fought for were beginning to take root. Reports of excessive force had dropped significantly. Trust between the police and the community was gradually rebuilding, and the precinct itself felt less fractured. Though progress was uneven, Chloe could feel the tide shifting. She stood in front of a packed audience at City Hall, flanked by a panel of officers and community leaders. This was no ordinary press conference. It was a public forum to address the reforms implemented under her leadership. The room buzzed with anticipation as Chloe stepped to the microphone. Good evening, she began, her voice firm and steady. When I became commissioner, I promised transparency, accountability, and reform. Tonight, I'm here to report on the progress we've made and to acknowledge the work still ahead of us. Chloe gestured to a slide projected behind her, showing statistics. In the last 6 months, complaints against officers have decreased by 40%. Community forums have led to actionable solutions for public safety, and our pilot programs in neighborhood engagement are seeing tangible results. The audience murmured in approval, but Chloe didn't let the moment linger. These numbers represent progress, she said, her tone sharpening, but they don't erase the pain or mistrust that existed before. We can't forget the lives lost, the mistakes made, or the people hurt by a broken system. This progress is just the beginning, not the conclusion. She turned to Officer Megan Ellis, who sat in the front row. Officers like Ellis here have shown us what the future of policing can look like, working with the community instead of against it, approaching every situation with respect and humanity. Ellis nodded, a faint smile crossing her face. As Chloe continued outlining her vision for long-term change, a voice called out from the back of the room. What about the officers who've left because of these reforms? It was Richard Grant, his arms crossed, his expression defiant. You act like everyone's on board, but the truth is, you've divided this department. The room fell silent, tension crackling in the air. Chloe didn't hesitate. Yes, Captain Grant, these reforms have divided us, she said, her voice cutting through the room. They've drawn a line between those who are willing to change and those who cling to outdated practices that have no place in modern policing. Grant's jaw tightened, but Chloe pressed on. If officers have chosen to leave because they can't uphold the principles of integrity, accountability, and fairness, then they've made the right choice, for themselves and for this department. Change isn't easy, and it's not for everyone, but it is necessary. The audience erupted into applause, drowning out whatever retort Grant might have had. As the noise died down, Chloe leaned into the microphone, her tone softening, but her conviction unshaken. I didn't take this job to make friends or win popularity contests. I took it because I believe in justice, not just as a concept, but as a way of life. Justice isn't handed to us. It's something we have to fight for every single. She paused, her eyes scanning the room. That fight doesn't end with better policies or lower complaint numbers. It continues in every interaction, every decision, every moment we wear this badge. And it's not just the responsibility of the police. It's a shared commitment between law enforcement and the people we serve. After Chloe's speech, members of the community were invited to speak. Marcia Walker, who had become a prominent advocate for police reform after the loss of her son, approached the mic. "I never thought I'd see a day when I could stand in front of this department and say thank you," Marcia began, her voice trembling. "But Commissioner Carter, you've given me hope. Hope that no other mother will have to go through what I did. Hope that change is possible." Tears welled in Chloe's eyes, but she held her composure, nodding in gratitude. Another speaker, a young black man named Andre, stepped up next. "For the first time in my life, I don't feel scared when I see a police car drive by," he said. "That's because of what you're doing here, Commissioner. Don't." The applause that followed was thunderous. As the forum concluded, Chloe delivered her closing remarks. "Tonight, we've seen what's possible when we come together as a community, when we refuse to accept the status quo and demand something better. This isn't the end of the road. It's the beginning of a journey toward a safer, fairer river." She glanced at the officers seated before her, her gaze unwavering. "To the members of this department, your actions define our future. Every call you respond to, every decision you make, it all matters. Remember why you put on this uniform. Remember that serving this community is an honor, not." Finally, she turned to the audience, her voice rising with conviction. "Justice is not a gift. It's not something we're granted. It's something we fight for. And it's a fight where..." The room stood in unison, applause echoing through the hall as Chloe stepped back from the podium. As Chloe left City Hall that evening, the weight of the day settled on her shoulders. But for the first time in months, she felt a spark of hope, not just for herself, but for the city she was determined to transform. The work was far from finished, but Chloe knew the foundation had been laid. The future of River Heights would be built on these moments, and she was ready to see it through. What do you think? Can one leader truly transform a broken system, or does lasting change require something more? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. If you enjoyed this story of resilience, justice, and reform, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring content. Together, let's keep the conversation about change alive.
The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above. Marcus Henderson stood at the head of the long oak conference table, his hands firmly planted on the surface. His eyes scanned the room, a mix of faces, some attentive, some indifferent, and others blatantly hostile. The morning briefing had barely started, but the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Let me make one thing very clear," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. "This department will not tolerate profiling or misconduct. Period. I don't care how long you've been wearing that badge. I don't care how many arrests you've made. If you cross the line, you'll answer to me." A few officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging wary glances. At the far end of the table, Greg Sanders leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. His body language screamed defiance. "Chief," Greg said, his voice dripping with mock politeness, "with all due respect, maybe you're new here, but this isn't some PR campaign. Out there, it's about survival. We don't have the luxury of second-guessing every decision. You hesitate, you die. That's reality." Marcus straightened, his gaze locking onto Greg's. "Survival doesn't mean abandoning your humanity, Sanders. The people out there are not your enemies. They're our community, and we're here to protect them, not prey on them." Greg let out a short laugh, shaking his head. Spoken like someone who's never had to make a split-second decision in the field. The air grew colder, the room falling into an uneasy silence. Marcus felt the weight of every eye on him, but he refused to let it shake him. He knew Greg's words weren't just about the policy changes he was implementing. This was personal, a challenge to his authority. "You're out of line," Marcus said, his tone sharper now. "If you have an issue with my leadership, you can take it up with me privately. But let me remind you, Officer Sanders, this is not a debate. It's an order. Greg's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. Understood, Chief, he said, the sarcasm thick in his voice. Marcus held his gaze for a beat longer before turning his attention back to the rest of the room. Now, let's move on. Patrol assignments for today. Before he could finish, the door to the room swung open, and Officer Angela Ruiz stepped in, her face pale. She hesitated, looking between Marcus and Greg, before speaking. Chief, there's been an incident. You need to see this. Marcus frowned. What kind of incident? Angela glanced at Greg, then back at Marcus. It's about the checkpoint on Elm Street this morning. There's a video. It's already online. The room buzzed with murmurs as Marcus's stomach tightened. He gestured for Angela to come closer, and she handed him her phone. On the screen was a grainy video, shaky but clear enough to show what had unfolded earlier that day. Greg stood in the center of the frame, his gun raised and pointed at Marcus. The footage didn't capture audio, but the image was damning. Civilians could be seen in the background, their phones up, recording the confrontation. Marcus was in the shot too, standing tall, his hands raised in a calming gesture. The video ended abruptly, but its impact lingered. Marcus set the phone down on the table, his jaw tight. "What the hell is this, Sanders?" he demanded, his voice low but heavy with controlled anger. Greg sat up straighter, his smirk replaced by a defensive scowl. "Chief, that's not the whole story. That kid, he was acting suspicious. I was doing my job. You were the one who stepped in and escalated things." "Escalated?" Marcus's voice rose slightly, his frustration breaking through. "You pointed your weapon at your commanding officer, Greg. Do you have any idea how this looks? To the department? To the public?" Greg shrugged, his defiance returning. "They don't know what it's like out there. Neither do you, apparently. That kid was reaching for something. I don't care what it looks like on video. I wasn't about to let some punk take me out." Marcus took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "That punk, as you call him, had no weapon. You stopped him without cause. You escalated the situation, and when I stepped in to de-escalate, you pointed a gun at me. You think that's acceptable?" Greg stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You're twisting this, Chief. You've had it out for me since day one. I'm just the easy target because I don't fit into your little vision of a reformed department." The room was deathly silent. Every officer was frozen, watching the confrontation with wide eyes. Marcus could feel the weight of their stares, their silent judgment. "You don't fit into this department because you refuse to change," Marcus shot back. "This isn't about you or me, Greg. It's about doing what's right. And if you can't handle that, maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here." Greg opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Marcus cut him off. "You're suspended, effective immediately. Turn in your badge and your weapon." Greg's face turned red, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "You're making a mistake, Henderson. You think you're a hero, but you're just another suit who doesn't get it. This department is going to eat you alive." Marcus didn't flinch. "Badge. Weapon. No." For a moment, it looked like Greg might refuse. His jaw clenched, his eyes burning with anger. But then, with a muttered curse, he unhooked his badge and gun and slammed them onto the table. "Good luck, Chief," Greg said, his voice dripping with venom. "You're gonna need it." He stormed out of the room, the door slamming shut behind him. Marcus exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each officer in turn. Some looked away, others stared back with barely concealed skepticism. "This is what accountability looks like," Marcus said finally, his voice steady but tired. "If anyone has a problem with that, my door is always open. But make no mistake, I'm here to change things. And change isn't optional." With that, he turned and left the room, the tension lingering like a storm cloud. In the hallway, Angela caught up with him. "Chief," she said softly, "what are you going to do about the video?" Marcus stopped, running a hand over his face. "I'll handle it," he said, though even he wasn't sure how. The video was already out there, and the damage was done. But something about it didn't sit right with him. As he replayed the confrontation in his mind, a nagging thought began to take shape. The footage wasn't just incriminating. It felt too perfect. The police station was quieter than usual, though the tension in the air felt like a storm about to break. Officers walked the halls with hurried steps, whispering in corners, their eyes darting toward Marcus Henderson's office. Behind the closed door, Marcus sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen. The viral video played on a loop, every frame dissected by his sharp, trained eyes. There was something off. The way the camera had captured the moment so perfectly, Greg pointing his gun, Marcus standing still with his hands raised, it looked too polished. Too clean. Almost staged. But he couldn't pinpoint why, and that only frustrated him further. A knock on the door broke his concentration. "Come in," Marcus said, his voice clipped. Angela Ruiz stepped inside, her expression cautious but resolute. She held a folder in her hands. "Chief, I've been going through the comments and shares on the video," she began, closing the door behind her. "I think you're going to want to see this." Marcus leaned back in his chair, gesturing for her to continue. Angela placed the folder on his desk, flipping it open to reveal a series of screenshots. The video first appeared on a Facebook account that only has one post, this one. No profile picture, no friends, no history. It's a burner account. But here's the strange part. The account was created 3 days ago, before the incident even happened. Marcus's eyebrows knitted together. "Before the incident?" She nodded. "Exactly." And the video wasn't uploaded directly from a phone. It was edited first. The metadata shows it was processed through a video editing program. Someone wanted this to go viral, Chief. Marcus exhaled sharply, the realization sinking in. "Someone's orchestrating this," he muttered. "This isn't just about Greg's actions. It's about undermining me." Angela hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Chief, I think it's more than that. Whoever did this didn't just want to embarrass you. They wanted to destroy you." The comments under the video are full of coordinated attacks, calling for your resignation, accusing you of being weak, a hypocrite, even corrupt. Marcus rubbed his temples, a familiar ache forming behind his eyes. The job had never been easy, but this felt different. It wasn't just resistance to change, it was sabotage. "Angela," Marcus said, his voice firm despite the weight in his chest, "we need to figure out who's behind this. Start by tracking the IP address tied to that burner account. And look into who had access to the checkpoint footage from this morning. Someone inside this department is feeding them material." Angela nodded. "I'll get on it right away." As she turned to leave, Marcus called after her. "Angela." She stopped, looking back. "Be careful who you trust," he said. She nodded again, her expression grave, before slipping out the door. Later that afternoon, Marcus walked into the squad room, his presence commanding immediate attention. Conversations halted, and officers looked up from their desks, some with curiosity, others with thinly veiled resentment. "Listen up," Marcus announced, his voice cutting through the room. "I know some of you are questioning the decisions I've made, and I know this video has everyone talking. Let me remind you all, I'm here to lead this department into something better. If that makes some of you uncomfortable, so be it. But I won't tolerate division or insubordination. If you've got a problem with me, my door is open. Otherwise, I suggest you focus on doing your jobs." The room was silent, tension rippling through the air like a live wire. Marcus's eyes scanned the room, daring anyone to challenge him. Greg Sanders wasn't there. His absence was a gaping hole in the dynamic, but Marcus knew better than to let it distract him. Greg's suspension had sent shockwaves through the department, and the fallout was only just beginning. As Marcus turned to leave, a voice called out, "Chief." He stopped, turning back. It was Officer Brian Taylor, a younger cop who had always seemed eager to prove himself. His face was set, his tone cautious but firm. "With all due respect," Brian said, his voice steady, "a lot of us feel like we're being kept in the dark. That video's out there, and the whole city's watching. We're the ones on the front lines, and we don't even know what to say when people ask us what happened." There were murmurs of agreement around the room. Marcus stepped closer, his hands resting on his hips. "I understand where you're coming from, Taylor. But this situation is complicated. The investigation is ongoing, and I can't share details until I have the full picture." "That's not good enough," another voice said. This time it was Officer Megan Cartwright, one of Greg's closest allies. "People are calling us racists, thugs. And now they think our own chief doesn't trust us." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Trust is earned, Officer Cartwright. And right now, this department has a lot to prove, to the community and to me. If you think this is hard, imagine what it's like for the people out there who've been dealing with bad policing for years. This isn't about making us comfortable. It's about doing what's right." Megan folded her arms, her eyes narrowing. "Maybe what's right isn't as black and white as you think, Chief." The room fell silent again, the tension palpable. Marcus held her gaze, his expression unreadable. "If you have a problem with the way I lead," Marcus said quietly, his voice razor-sharp, "then I suggest you take it up with me privately. But don't mistake my calm for weakness. I'm here to fix what's broken, whether you're with me or not." With that, he turned and walked out, his footsteps echoing in the quiet room. Back in his office, Marcus sank into his chair, the weight of the day pressing down on him. He stared at his computer screen, the video still paused at the moment Greg's gun was pointed at him. The knock came before he could hit play again. This time, it was Deputy Chief Charles Langston, a grizzled veteran with decades of experience. Langston had always been a neutral presence, respected but reserved. "Got a minute?" Langston asked, stepping inside without waiting for an answer. Marcus nodded, gesturing for him to sit. Langston settled into the chair across from him, his expression unreadable. "Hell of a day," he said, his voice gravelly. "You could say that," Marcus replied, leaning back in his chair. Langston studied him for a moment before speaking. "You're making waves, Chief. Big ones. Not everyone's gonna like it." "I didn't take this job to be liked," Marcus said. "Good," Langston said, leaning forward. "Because whoever leaked that video, they're playing dirty. And I don't think they're done yet." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "You think someone in the department's behind this?" Langston shrugged. "I've been around long enough to know when something doesn't smell right. And this reeks. Someone wants you out of the picture, Marcus. Question is, how far are they willing to go to make that happen?" Marcus didn't respond right away, the weight of Langston's words sinking in. He had always known that change would come with resistance, but this felt like a war. "Then we find out who it is," Marcus said finally, his voice firm. "And we stop them." Langston nodded, a glimmer of approval in his eyes. "Be careful, Marcus. Not everyone in this building is on your side." As Langston left, Marcus sat in silence, the enormity of the situation pressing down on him. He was fighting not just for his leadership, but for the soul of the department. And somewhere out there, someone was determined to see him fail. The city felt different. It wasn't just the news trucks parked outside the station or the protests gathering at City Hall. It was the way people looked at Marcus Henderson now. Some saw him as a symbol of progress, a man standing up for what was right. But others, especially from within the department, saw him as a threat, a man trying to dismantle a system they believed in, however flawed it might be. Marcus stood by the window in his office, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared out at the growing crowd of protesters down the block. Their chants were faint through the glass, but still clear enough to understand. "Justice for Marcus. Fire the dirty cops." The irony wasn't lost on him. The video, doctored as it was, had painted Greg as the villain, and rightly so for his actions. But the situation was more complicated than the public understood. The truth was still out there, buried under layers of manipulation. Angela Ruiz entered without knocking, her laptop tucked under one arm and a folder in the other. She looked exhausted, her usual sharp focus dulled by sleepless nights spent sifting through endless threads of digital breadcrumbs. "Chief," she said, closing the door behind her. "I've got something." Marcus turned from the window, his face unreadable but his posture tense. "Tell me." Angela sat down across from him, flipping open the laptop and turning the screen toward him. "I traced the IP address tied to the burner account that uploaded the video. It's not conclusive yet, but it leads to a proxy server routed through a coffee shop downtown. More importantly, I found a second account connected to the same proxy, and this one has a little more activity." Marcus leaned closer, his eyes scanning the screen. The account had been posting under a pseudonym, commenting on local news articles and forums, spreading the video while carefully planting narratives that painted Marcus as weak and divisive. "They've been setting this up for weeks," Angela continued. "Whoever this is, they knew exactly how to manipulate the public. The editing, the timing, the fake outrage, it's all coordinated." Marcus's jaw tightened. "And you think this person is inside the department?" Angela hesitated, then nodded. The original video footage, the unedited version, could only have come from the squad car camera at the checkpoint. "I checked the logs. The footage was uploaded to the department's cloud server at 9:13 a.m. By 9:30 a.m., it was downloaded from an internal IP address. 15 minutes later, it was uploaded to the burner account." Marcus's stomach sank. "So, someone in this building—" Angela nodded again. "Someone with access." For a moment, Marcus said nothing, his mind racing. His instincts told him to trust Angela's findings, but the implications were staggering. If someone within his own department was orchestrating this, it meant the rot ran deeper than he'd imagined. Who had access to the footage at that time? Marcus asked finally. Angela hesitated. "That's where it gets tricky. Technically, anyone with the right clearance could have accessed it. But there's a short list of people who would have had reason to pull that specific file so quickly after the incident." She handed him the folder she'd brought in. Inside was a list of names, each one sending a pang of unease through Marcus. One name stood out: Deputy Chief Charles Langston. That evening, Marcus sat across from Langston in the deputy chief's cramped office. The man had been with the department for decades, and his gruff demeanor and no-nonsense attitude had made him a trusted figure, at least until now. Langston leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but guarded. "You've got something on your mind, Chief. Out with it." Marcus didn't waste time. The footage from the checkpoint. It was pulled from the server 15 minutes before the edited version showed up online. "Your name's on the access log." Langston's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't flinch. "So now I'm a suspect." "I'm asking questions," Marcus said, his voice firm but measured. "Because someone is trying to undermine this department, and I need to know if you're a part of it." Langston let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But you're barking up the wrong tree. I pulled that footage because I was reviewing the incident. Standard procedure, or have you forgotten how this job works? And did you notice anything unusual in the footage?" Marcus pressed. Langston leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. "Yeah, I noticed something. You stepping in and making a scene. Greg's an ass, but you humiliated him in front of civilians and his team. You escalated just as much as he did." Marcus's jaw tightened. "That's not an answer." Langston sighed, his expression hardening. "You think I leaked that video? After 30 years in this department, you think I'd risk my reputation to play games?" "I don't know what to think, Charles," Marcus said, his voice low. "But someone in this building wants me gone, and right now, you're not giving me a reason to take you off the list." Langston's eyes darkened, and for a moment, the room was silent. Then, slowly, he stood, his imposing frame casting a long shadow across the desk. "You want to fix this department, Marcus? Fine. But you've got no idea what you're up against. You think it's just Greg and a few bad apples? It's deeper than that. There are people, powerful people, who don't want to see you succeed. And if you keep pushing, they'll bury you." Marcus stood as well, refusing to be intimidated. "Let them try." Langston smirked, but there was no humor in it. "You've got guts, kid. But guts won't save you when the knives come out." As Marcus left Langston's office, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Angela. "I found something," she said, her voice tense. "The second burner account, it just posted again. This time, they uploaded something new." Marcus's heart sank as he pulled the phone from his pocket and opened the link Angela had sent. It was another video, this one a compilation of moments taken out of context. Marcus raising his voice at officers during meetings, community members shouting at him during public forums, and, most damning of all, a moment where he appeared to lose his temper during a tense exchange with Greg Weeks before the checkpoint incident. The captions painted a clear narrative, a leader unfit to serve. Marcus stared at the screen, his mind racing. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to embarrass him, they were building a case to destroy his credibility entirely. And they were doing a damn good job. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, but Marcus Henderson couldn't feel the passage of time. He sat at his desk, the glow of his phone illuminating his face as he scrolled through comment after comment under the newest viral video. Power hungry. Not fit to lead. Just another politician in a uniform. The word stung, but it wasn't just the public sentiment that weighed on him. It was the fact that someone inside the department, was feeding this narrative. Angela Ruiz entered the room, closing the door carefully behind her. She carried an urgency in her movements, but her expression was wary, as though she were bracing herself for what she was about to say. "Chief," she began, placing a tablet on his desk and turning the screen toward him, "it's worse than we thought." Marcus rubbed his temples, already dreading what he was about to see. "What now?" Angela tapped the screen, bringing up an internal report she had been working on. "I cross-referenced the timestamps from the access logs on the checkpoint footage with the department's personnel tracking system. I can't give you a name yet, but I can narrow it down to 2 suspects, Officer Megan Cartwright and IT specialist Tony Delgado." Marcus frowned. "Delgado? He's not even a sworn officer." "Exactly," Angela said. "That's what makes it suspicious. Delgado works in the department's IT division, and his clearance would allow him to access, download, and manipulate footage without raising immediate red flags. But here's the thing, Megan was on patrol that morning, which means Delgado would have needed help getting the footage so quickly. That's where she comes in." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. "You think they're working together?" Angela nodded grimly. "It's possible. Cartwright's been vocal about her loyalty to Greg Sanders, and Delgado, well, let's just say he's not exactly a fan of your leadership either. He's been known to make comments in the break room about how you're trying to gut the department with your reforms." Marcus sighed, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. "So, we've got a cop with a grudge and an IT specialist with the skills to make this happen. But why? What do they gain by sabotaging me like this?" Angela hesitated before responding. "Power. Influence. Maybe even protection. If you're ousted, someone like Greg could rally the old guard and stop the changes you're trying to make. Delgado might see himself as part of that. And Megan, well, she's clearly willing to take risks to defend people like Greg." Marcus nodded slowly, the pieces falling into place. "We need proof," he said finally. "Something solid. If we go after them without evidence, it'll look like I'm retaliating against my critics. And that's exactly what they want." Angela gave a curt nod. "I'll keep digging. But Chief, you need to be careful. Whoever's behind this isn't just playing dirty, they're dangerous. And if they're willing to manipulate the public like this, they won't hesitate to escalate." "I'll handle it," Marcus said, his voice firm despite the uncertainty gnawing at him. That night, Marcus left the station later than usual, his body weary but his mind still racing. The streets were quieter now, the protests having dispersed for the evening, but the tension lingered in the air. As he approached his car, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text message from an unknown number. "You don't belong here. Step down, or we'll make sure you regret it." Marcus stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. The message wasn't entirely unexpected. He'd received anonymous threats before, but this one felt more personal. The use of "we" was a chilling reminder that this wasn't the work of a lone disgruntled officer. Sliding into the driver's seat, Marcus quickly forwarded the message to Angela with a note, "Track this number." He didn't expect a quick answer. It would take time to trace the sender, but he couldn't afford to let his guard down. As he pulled out of the parking lot, his thoughts returned to the 2 suspects, Megan Cartwright and Tony Delgado. The more he considered the timeline of events, the more it made sense. Megan had been openly critical of him for months, her loyalty to Greg Sanders evident in her every interaction. Delgado, on the other hand, was quieter, more calculating. Marcus didn't know much about him personally, but Angela's intel painted a picture of a man who preferred to operate from the shadows. The city's streets blurred past as Marcus drove, his mind running through the possibilities. Was Megan the mastermind, using Delgado's technical skills to carry out her plans? Or was Delgado pulling the strings, using Megan as a pawn to access the footage? Either way, Marcus knew one thing for certain: he needed to confront them. The next morning, Marcus called Megan into his office. She arrived with her usual guarded expression, her posture stiff but confident. "You wanted to see me, Chief?" she asked, her tone neutral but with an edge that Marcus couldn't ignore. "Have a seat," Marcus said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Megan sat down, crossing her legs and folding her hands in her lap. "I'll get straight to the point," Marcus began, his voice calm but firm. "The video of the checkpoint incident, it was edited and leaked to the public. We have evidence that it was accessed from within the department." Megan raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. "And you think I had something to do with it?" "I think you've made it clear where your loyalties lie," Marcus said. "You've been vocal about your support for Greg Sanders, and you've been critical of my leadership. So, yes, I have questions for you." Megan's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure. "With all due respect, Chief, that's a pretty big leap. Just because I don't agree with your policies doesn't mean I'm sabotaging you. And if you're accusing me of something, I'd like to see your proof." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "This isn't an accusation, Officer Cartwright. It's an investigation. And until we get to the bottom of it, I need to know that I can trust everyone in this department, including you." Megan met his gaze, her expression hardening. "I've done my job by the book, Chief. If you're looking for someone to blame, maybe you should start with yourself. You've alienated half this department with your so-called reforms, and now you're surprised that people are pushing back." Marcus felt a flicker of anger but kept his tone even. "Reform isn't easy. Change makes people uncomfortable. But that doesn't excuse undermining this department or betraying the trust of the community we serve." Megan stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I don't have to sit here and listen to this," she said, her voice cold. "If you want to accuse me of something, put it in writing. Otherwise, I'll be on patrol, doing my job." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked out, the door slamming shut behind her. Marcus exhaled, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. Megan's reaction had been defensive, but was it genuine outrage or a calculated deflection? Either way, he couldn't afford to let her out of his sight. That afternoon, Angela burst into Marcus's office, her face flushed with urgency. "Chief, we've got him," she said, holding up her phone. "Who?" Marcus asked, standing quickly. "Delgado," Angela said. "I traced the number that sent you the threat last night. It's linked to a burner phone, but I matched the purchase records with Delgado's credit card. He's been covering his tracks, but he slipped up." Marcus's stomach churned. The evidence was damning, but it wasn't over yet. Delgado wasn't the type to act alone. "Bring him in," Marcus said, his voice hardening. "It's time we got some answers." The small interrogation room felt colder than usual, its fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on the gray walls. Tony Delgado sat at the metal table, his arms crossed, a sheen of sweat glistening on his forehead. Across from him, Marcus Henderson stood with his arms behind his back, his calm demeanor masking the storm brewing inside. Angela Ruiz leaned against the wall, her tablet in hand, ready to back up every piece of evidence they had gathered. Delgado tried to keep his composure, but Marcus could see the cracks forming. "So," Marcus began, his voice measured, "why don't you start by explaining why your credit card was used to purchase a burner phone, which just so happened to send a threat to my personal number last night?" Delgado shifted in his chair, his eyes darting between Marcus and Angela. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said quickly. "This is some kind of mistake." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his expression unflinching. "A mistake?" "We traced the IP address from the burner account that uploaded the doctored checkpoint video. It was routed through the department's proxy server, a server you have full access to. And now we've tied the burner phone to you. Do you really think we're here without evidence?" Delgado swallowed hard, his confidence slipping further. I don't know how that happened," he stammered. "Someone must have used my credentials. I didn't leak anything." Angela stepped forward, her tablet lighting up as she tapped the screen. "Your login credentials were used to access the footage 15 minutes after it was uploaded to the department server," she said, her tone sharp. "You downloaded it, edited it, and uploaded it to the burner account. Don't even try to deny it. We have the logs." Delgado's face turned red, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "I'm not the only one who had access to that footage," he snapped. "If you're so damn sure it was me, why don't you look at everyone else?" Marcus stepped closer, his voice lowering but carrying more weight. "We already did. And all the evidence points to you. But here's what I really want to know. Why? What was your motive, Tony? Who put you up to this?" Delgado clenched his jaw, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, it seemed like he might stay silent. But then, his defiance cracked. "You think you're some kind of savior, don't you?" he spat. "Coming in here, turning everything upside down, making everyone feel like they're the problem. You don't belong in this department, Henderson. You never did." Marcus didn't flinch. "That's not a motive. That's an excuse. Who else is involved?" Delgado hesitated, his eyes darting toward the door as if calculating an escape route. Finally, he exhaled sharply and leaned back in his chair, his expression a mix of anger and resignation. "It wasn't just me," he admitted. "Cartwright helped. She gave me the footage. But it wasn't her idea." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Then whose idea was it?" Delgado hesitated again, his hands fidgeting on the table. "Sanders," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Greg Sanders. He came to me weeks ago, said he needed my help to send a message. Said you were destroying the department, making us weak. He convinced Megan to get the footage and bring it to me. I didn't want to do it, but Greg, he's persuasive." Angela exchanged a quick glance with Marcus, her expression hardening. Marcus's voice dropped, colder now. "Where is Greg now?" Delgado shook his head. "I don't know. I haven't talked to him since the video went up. He said he'd handle things from here." Marcus straightened, his jaw tight. "Handle what, Tony? What's his next move?" Delgado looked genuinely terrified now. "I don't know," he said, his voice trembling. "I swear, Chief. I don't know. He just said this wasn't over." By the time Marcus left the interrogation room, his mind was racing. Angela followed closely behind, her tablet clutched tightly in her hands. "Greg's on the run," Angela said, her tone urgent. "We need to put out a bolo and alert the department." Marcus nodded, his face grim. "Do it. And send an alert to the precinct captains. Tell them to stay on high alert. Greg's unpredictable, and we don't know how far he's willing to go." Angela paused, hesitating for a moment. "Chief," she said quietly, "if Greg really believes he's doing this to save the department, he might target you directly." Marcus met her gaze, his expression steady despite the weight of her words. "Let him," he said. "This ends now." That evening, Marcus returned to his office, the station buzzing with activity as officers scrambled to track Greg's movements. Reports came in from neighboring precincts, but there was no sign of him. Marcus sat at his desk, his eyes scanning the files Angela had compiled on Greg, his service record, disciplinary history, and notes from their time working together. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Angela again, her face pale. "Chief," she said, stepping inside, "we found something." She placed a printout on his desk. It was a screenshot from a private message Greg had sent to Megan Cartwright the night before the video was leaked. The message was short but chilling. "If Henderson won't step down, we'll give him a reason to. Meet me at the warehouse on 9th. Marcus's stomach twisted. The warehouse on 9th Street was an abandoned facility on the edge of town, a place notorious for illegal activity. "I'm going," Marcus said, standing abruptly. Angela's eyes widened. "Chief, you can't." "I'm not waiting for Greg to make the next move," Marcus said firmly. "If he's there, this ends tonight. Call for backup, but tell them to hang back until I give the signal." Angela hesitated, but the determination in Marcus's eyes left no room for argument. She nodded reluctantly. "Be careful," she said. The warehouse was dark and quiet, its rusted exterior illuminated only by the faint glow of the moon. Marcus stepped out of his car, his hand resting on the holster at his side. He approached the building cautiously, his footsteps echoing against the cracked pavement. Inside, the air was damp and heavy, the faint smell of mildew lingering in the shadows. Marcus moved through the maze of empty crates and broken machinery, his senses on high alert. "Marcus." The voice came from the far end of the room. Greg Sanders stepped out from the shadows, a gun in his hand but pointed at the ground. His face was a mix of anger and exhaustion, his usually confident demeanor now tinged with desperation. You shouldn't have come here alone, Greg said, his voice low. Marcus stopped a few feet away, his hands at his sides. You wanted my attention, Greg. Now you've got it. Greg laughed bitterly, shaking his head. You don't get it, do you? This isn't about you and me. This is about the department. About survival. You think your reforms are fixing things, but all you're doing is tearing us apart. Marcus's voice was calm but firm. What I'm doing is holding us accountable. What you're doing is trying to drag us back into the past. Greg raised his gun, his hand trembling slightly. You've turned everyone against me, he said, his voice breaking. I gave my life to this job, and now I'm the bad guy. You did that to yourself, Marcus said, taking a careful step closer. But it's not too late to make it right. Put the gun down, Greg. For a moment, Greg hesitated, his grip on the weapon faltering. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Then, with a shaky exhale, Greg lowered the gun and dropped it to the ground. His shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. Sirens wailed in the distance as backup arrived, the sound growing louder with each passing second. Marcus stepped forward, placing a firm hand on Greg's shoulder. It's over, Marcus said quietly. Greg didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the ground. In the days that followed, the department began to stabilize. Greg's arrest marked a turning point, a signal that no one was above accountability, not even those who had once been considered untouchable. Delgado and Megan were also placed under arrest, their roles in the conspiracy laid bare for all to see. For Marcus, the road ahead was still long. The scars left by the ordeal would take time to heal, both for the department and the community. But as he stood at the podium during a press conference, addressing the city he had sworn to serve, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Change isn't easy, Marcus said, his voice steady and resolute. But it's necessary. And it's worth fighting for. The crowd erupted into applause, but Marcus knew the real work was just beginning. And he was ready for it.